Have you ever lost everything? Not just material things, but all your memories, all your beliefs. One night, fire took it all, your home, your family, and everything you once loved. You wake up in a world that's empty, with only the unshakable pain that can never be erased. After all this, do you still believe in miracles? Or will you bury yourself in despair, accepting that you've lost everything? And if, just if, a single chance appears before you, would you dare to seize it? In the midst of a simple horse auction, surrounded by strangers, a man stands in silence. He doesn't speak a word, nor does he beg with his eyes. His gaze only stops at one horse. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's all he ever had. That horse, an old friend, the very part of his soul that he had lost. Despite the mockery and ridicule from the crowd, he doesn't move. Because he knows some things can't be measured by money or power. Some values are understood only by the heart. So what would you do when you have nothing left to lose? When all eyes are on you, but deep down, you know there's only one thought: I can't give up this time. Is it friendship? Or is it your very self? The answer will be revealed when that horse steps toward him. Let's explore this heart-touching story right now. The cold March wind swept across Clayville like a ghost, tearing through the gray clouds and shaking the barren fields. The earth was dry, as if it had endured hundreds of years of solitude and silence. The air was heavy, so still that you could almost feel the rush of wind as it cut through. The sky was thick with a blanket of gray clouds, with no sunlight breaking through, just heavy clouds hanging low, as if ready to fall to the ground. The trees stood motionless, with not a gust of wind, not a sound. Everything seemed to be waiting for something, but it wasn't clear what. This land, Clayville, wasn't one of bustling life. It was like a place that had been forgotten, a desolate patch of earth where people came and went, and the wind blew by unnoticed. The wide, open fields only saw wild grass and dust. Everything was still, melancholic. The remnants of days gone by, of a golden time long past, lingered in the air. In the midst of this, the horse auction was taking place at the Clayville Farmers Market. The laborers, dressed in old, worn clothing, stood around the auction area. Their hands were rough, calloused from years of hard work, and their boots were caked with dirt. Their eyes were focused on the horses. A few people were in heated discussion about the horses up for bid, debating breeds and values. Others exchanged stories about their lives, about the years spent struggling to make a living in this poor countryside. The sounds of laughter and voices mingled with the stillness of the land, creating a sense that their world was both arid and full of quiet sorrow. And in the midst of the crowd, Jonathan Harris walked in. His footsteps made no sound. No one around him noticed. No one knew he was there. Jonathan moved through the crowd silently, without a word, without a glance, without any form of communication with anyone. He passed through the crowd like a shadow. His movements were heavy, as if each step carried a weight that couldn't be lifted. Jonathan was a middle-aged man, lean and weathered, with tanned skin and hands rough from years of hard labor. His life had been marked by pain. He lived a simple life, one of solitude, with few who knew him. But in his silence, there was a deep sadness, a longing that had been buried for too long. Jonathan's gaze wasn't filled with the confidence that others around him carried, nor did he have the showmanship of the wealthy. He didn't look at the strong, healthy horses, the well-groomed creatures shining under the sun. His eyes were focused on just one horse, a horse he knew all too well, a horse he could never forget, even though time had passed. It was Thunderstorm, a chestnut stallion with a white blaze running down its face, standing still in the pen, as if it was waiting for something. And in that moment, Jonathan's eyes met Thunderstorm's. All the noise around him seemed to fade away. The laughter stopped, the voices hushed. Only two gazes met, a man and a horse. A connection forgotten, but never truly erased. Jonathan stood there, silent. No words, no movements. Only the stillness, the silence of a man who had lost everything. And in his eyes, there was something burning, a desire, a longing, a memory that had been pushed down for far too long. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to beg. He just needed this moment. A moment to see the horse he had lost so many years ago. Thunderstorm, that horse, was the memory, was all that he had, a part of a past he could never let go. And in his heart, there was only one thing, that horse is mine. The sun had faded behind thick, dense clouds, but the darkness had yet to fully settle in. The weak rays that remained filtered through the gaps in the trees, casting thin streaks of light on the ground, illuminating each of Jonathan's steps as he moved closer to the horse's pen. Each step he took felt heavy, as though the weight in his heart was growing with every passing moment, every tick of time adding to the confusion swirling within him. He didn't know why he was walking toward the crowd, didn't know why he kept moving forward. He only knew that some invisible force was pulling him closer to that horse, drawing him into a moment he knew he couldn't turn away from. The horse stood still in its pen, silent, as though it were waiting for someone. Jonathan's gaze couldn't tear itself away from it, not because of its beauty, but because of something far deeper. Thunderstorm, that powerful horse, with its chestnut coat and the white blaze on its forehead, its every movement felt like a living, breathing reminder of memories that had lived in Jonathan's heart for years. Every line of its body, every strand of hair on its coat, every twitch of its muscles was like a reminder of a past he couldn't forget. It was as if this horse was a part of him, a part of everything he had lost. Thunderstorm's eyes were bright, but not with joy or happiness. No, there was something else in those eyes, something like waiting, something like understanding. This horse had seen many things, lived through hardship, yet its eyes still burned with a sense that it was searching for something. A connection. A kind of knowing that no one could explain. And as Jonathan's eyes met Thunderstorm's, everything around them seemed to stop. The world around them seemed to fade away. All the sounds from the crowd grew dim, leaving only that one moment that couldn't be put into words. Only two sets of eyes, one human, one horse, locked together. In Thunderstorm's eyes, Jonathan saw familiarity. He didn't need to think much, didn't need to search the past. It was all right there, in those eyes, in that silence. At that moment, Jonathan's memories crashed back upon him like a wave, relentless and overwhelming. He remembered the bright days when he lived with Thunderstorm, when he was a happy rancher, needing nothing more than his horses and long afternoons on the open fields. Thunderstorm had always been there, a friend, a companion, always knowing how to ease the loneliness in his heart. Those memories rushed back to Jonathan with such vividness that it felt like a vice tightening around his chest. It wasn't sadness, but something more raw, more painful. He remembered that fateful night, the night the fire consumed everything, taking away everything he had ever loved. He remembered running through the darkness, the screams of the horses, the roar of the fire as it devoured everything. He remembered the desperate moments when he had thrown himself into the flames, searching for Thunderstorm, but he never found him. When he awoke, everything was gone, and all that remained was a dull ache in his heart. Why today? Why now, after 12 years, was he standing here, facing the horse he had lost? Jonathan couldn't explain it. All he knew was that, in this moment, everything had passed, but Thunderstorm still stood there, like a part of him, a part of a memory that couldn't be erased. Jonathan felt every fiber of his being pulling toward Thunderstorm, as if some invisible thread had connected them once more. He knew he couldn't let this moment slip away, couldn't let this chance fade into the distance. A part of him had been lost for so many years, but now it had returned, standing before him. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't let this moment slip away. He stepped toward Thunderstorm, slow, deliberate. Each step carried with it a weight of pain, a longing that had been buried deep for so long. But he couldn't stop. He knew that he had to get closer, closer still, until his hand could touch the horse's body, to feel the life in it, to feel the existence he had lost. When he reached the horse, there was no longer any sense of strangeness between them. There was only a strange familiarity, as if time had torn itself apart. Thunderstorm was no longer standing still like a statue. It began to move, its eyes never leaving Jonathan. It wasn't in a rush, but it moved towards Jonathan, slow and deliberate, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. And when the horse finally reached Jonathan, it lowered its head, gently brushing against his shoulder, as if confirming something. A greeting, a recognition. No whinny, no loud gesture. Just the silence of two souls, finding each other in a moment of profound emotion. Jonathan grasped Thunderstorm's shoulder, feeling the warmth of its body radiate into his hand. And in that moment, he understood, even though everything had been lost, there were things that could never be taken away, memories, connections that couldn't be erased, no matter how long time passed. The scene was now filled not only with the silence of those around Jonathan but also the murmurs and mocking laughter that seemed to hang in the air like a dark cloud. Jonathan stood there, still unable to tear his eyes away from Thunderstorm. Everything around him seemed to slow, but not because of the quiet inside him, it was because the people around him could not comprehend his unwavering resolve. They began to whisper, their voices unclear but dripping with disdain. "This old man surely doesn't have the money to buy this horse," one voice from the crowd murmured, laced with mockery. "What a joke! What does he think he's doing? How can he even think about bidding?" Another voice chimed in, followed by loud laughter that filled the air, only adding to the ridicule. Some in the crowd chuckled softly, their laughter echoing like knives stabbing into Jonathan's heart, but he didn't move. He didn't pay any attention to the jeers. Every laugh felt like a hard slap to his face, but what he felt wasn't shame or disappointment. No, what he felt was sadness, not because of the mocking, but because of the incomprehension in the eyes of those around him. They knew nothing about him. They didn't know the price he had paid, a price that could never be measured in any currency. He stood there, amidst the looks of scorn, under the thick silence that hung around him, but inside, something stirred stronger than the ridicule. It was a deep, powerful belief in something that only he understood. This horse was not a commodity, not something to buy and sell. It was a memory, the soul of lost days. Jonathan couldn't let it go. As the tension in the air thickened, a figure moved toward him from behind the crowd, Richard Grant, the owner of the auction and the one who controlled the entire event. Richard was a man with a cold, sharp appearance, slender and dressed in fine clothes, completely different from the laborers surrounding him. He was a man of wealth, of power, and he had no regard for the human values or pasts of the horses he was selling. To him, these horses were nothing more than goods to be sold for his profit. Richard walked up to Jonathan, his eyes cold and commanding. "Old man, I think it's time for you to leave." Richard's voice was thick with contempt. "This is no place for you. You can't afford this horse. You know that." All eyes turned to the two men, and the air became heavy with expectation. The crowd began to murmur, their whispers eager to see how this confrontation would unfold between the poor man and the wealthy one. Jonathan, despite the pressure of the crowd, didn't back down. He stood tall, his eyes locked on Richard's, unflinching. Richard studied Jonathan, surprised by his unwavering resolve. "You think you can actually bid on this horse?" He smirked, the smile of someone who was sure of his victory, but in his eyes, there was a clear sign of disdain. "Go on, leave. All you're doing is making a fool of yourself in front of everyone." The crowd stirred, some laughing lightly, others staying silent. But Jonathan didn't falter. Though inside him there was a storm, a mix of embarrassment and fear of rejection, he stood firm, his hand tightly gripping the hat, his eyes still focused on the horse. It wasn't because he was overly confident, but because he knew he had no other choice. Seeing that Jonathan wasn't backing down, Richard took a step closer. He tried to assert dominance, but there was something in his eyes that began to waver. "Do you understand? This is a real auction. Not some game for the poor, Richard said, but this time, his tone had lost some of its arrogance. He hadn't expected someone like Jonathan to make him hesitate. Jonathan knew Richard didn't understand, but he didn't need to explain. He only needed to stand here, unwavering. Not because of the horse, but because he had lost too much to walk away. The years spent living in darkness, in silence, surrounded by pain. Loss, sorrow, those had all become part of him. No one in the crowd laughed anymore. The looks began to shift. There was a sense of respect beginning to form in their hearts, even though they didn't fully understand why Jonathan was so persistent. They saw a man fighting not just for a horse, but for something deeper, a belief that could not be shaken. Richard took a deep breath, trying to maintain his cold composure. "All right," he said, his eyes sharp as a knife, but now, his confidence seemed to be cracking. "I'll let you participate, but don't think for a second you'll have enough to win it." Jonathan didn't speak. He just stood there, but inside, a fierce belief flared like an unquenchable fire. He didn't need to win this auction, but he wasn't going to give up. Not ever. Before the fire, Jonathan's life was marked by simplicity and hard work, but also by a deep sense of fulfillment. His small ranch in the rolling hills of Clayville was modest, yet it was his pride and joy. There was a quiet happiness in the air that clung to the worn wooden walls of his farmhouse and to the fields where his horses roamed. The scent of fresh hay and the earthy smell of the land were familiar comforts that wrapped around him like a warm blanket every morning. For Jonathan, life was complete in the way that only a man who worked the land could understand. There was no rush, no pressure, just the rhythm of life that flowed through the seasons. His farm wasn't large, but it was enough. The land was fertile enough to keep a small herd of cattle, and his real passion, his heart and soul, was in his horses. Jonathan had raised and trained many horses over the years, but none was as close to his heart as Thunderstorm. Thunderstorm wasn't just another horse. It was his horse, one he had raised from a foal. He had trained it himself, and in many ways, it had grown into a mirror of Jonathan, strong, steadfast, and loyal. Thunderstorm was more than just a horse, it was a companion, a confidant. Jonathan would often take long walks across the fields, the sound of Thunderstorm's hooves the only sound that would echo in the quiet. He would sing softly to the horse, sometimes a tune from a long-forgotten country song, sometimes just humming to the rhythm of the earth beneath his feet. Thunderstorm would always listen, always stand by his side, as though it could sense when Jonathan needed it most. Their bond ran deep, far beyond the typical relationship between a man and his horse. Thunderstorm understood him in ways few humans could. There were days when Jonathan would come home feeling defeated, his body sore from the long hours of labor, and the horse would stand by the fence, waiting for him, as if it knew exactly how he felt. There were times when Jonathan was too tired to speak, and Thunderstorm would nudge him gently, as if to say, "I'm here." It was a connection that transcended words, a silent understanding. At night, after the day's work was done, Jonathan would sometimes sit on the porch with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the pasture. Thunderstorm would always be out there, grazing quietly, its head held high. Jonathan would talk to the horse as though it were a person, sharing his thoughts, his hopes, his fears. Thunderstorm never judged, never offered advice, but its presence was enough. For Jonathan, these were the moments of peace, the moments that made the long, hard work worth it. He didn't need much else. His family, his wife, Lila, and their 2 children, were the anchors that held his life steady, and Thunderstorm was his constant companion. Life was simple but fulfilling. It wasn't perfect, but in those moments, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Then came that night. That one fateful night that Jonathan would never forget, the night that changed everything forever. It began as a normal evening. Jonathan had tucked the children into bed, kissed Lila goodnight, and gone outside to check on the animals before heading to bed himself. The fire didn't give any warning. One moment, everything was calm, The crackling of the evening fire in the stove, the soft rustle of wind in the trees, and the next, there was a spark, a flicker in the distance. A flash that Jonathan would later swear he saw from the corner of his eye. He turned toward the barn. The smoke billowed quickly, thick and black, reaching up into the sky like an angry serpent. The wind, which had been calm all evening, suddenly picked up, feeding the flames. The barn was on fire. His heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. Thunderstorm. The only thought that ran through his head was the horse, the one that had been with him through everything. Without thinking, without hesitation, Jonathan ran toward the barn. He didn't remember how he got there. His legs moved on their own, driven by pure instinct, by the love for the creature that had been his companion for so many years. Smoke filled his lungs, and heat seared his skin, but none of that mattered. All he could think about was getting to Thunderstorm. His heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He could hear the crackling of the fire growing louder, the screams of the wood as it gave way to the flames. The door to the barn was engulfed in flames, but Jonathan didn't hesitate. He tried to force it open, tried to break through the inferno, but the heat was unbearable. His hands were burned by the intense heat, his face scorched as he finally managed to break through a small opening. He could see nothing but smoke, but he could hear the frantic sounds of hooves inside. Thunderstorm was still alive. Jonathan's heart leapt with relief. He shouted the horse's name, desperate to hear a response. He stumbled through the smoke, his eyes watering, his lungs screaming for air. But it was too late. By the time he reached the stall, Thunderstorm was already down. The fire had claimed too much. His beloved horse lay on the ground, struggling for breath, its body burned and broken. Jonathan's world crumbled in that instant. He reached up for Thunderstorm, pulling the horse's head into his lap, his own body trembling with the pain of seeing his companion so helpless. He begged, he pleaded, but nothing could change the course of fate. With one final, labored breath, Thunderstorm exhaled, and the life that had always been so full of vitality faded. Jonathan collapsed in the wreckage, the world spinning around him. He had tried to save the horse, but in the end, he couldn't. The fire had stolen everything. The barn, the livestock, and most painfully, the creature that had been his anchor. When the fire department arrived hours later, they found Jonathan unconscious, his body covered in burns. They told him that Thunderstorm had not made it out. There was nothing left of his horse, nothing but the remains of the barn and the ashes of the life he once knew. Jonathan didn't hear any of it. His mind was numb, and his heart was broken. He woke up in the hospital 3 days later, with burns on his arms and his lungs full of smoke. But all he could think about was the horse. Thunderstorm had been more than just a horse. It had been his best friend, his companion through thick and thin. And now, in a matter of hours, it was gone. The doctors told him that he was lucky to be alive. They told him the burns would heal, but there was no medicine for the pain that resided in his chest. Jonathan didn't need their sympathy. He didn't need their words. What he needed was the one thing he could never get back, his horse, his friend. The fire took everything. His farm, his animals, and his beloved Thunderstorm. And for years, Jonathan tried to bury that night, to forget the pain. But it lingered, a constant ache in his chest, a wound that time could never heal. And now, standing in the auction house, staring at Thunderstorm again, it was as if all that pain had been resurrected. All those years of grief and heartache had come rushing back, and Jonathan knew one thing: he couldn't let go. Not now, not ever. This wasn't just about a horse. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that he had lost, a piece of his soul that the fire had stolen from him. And he was willing to fight for it, no matter what it took. The tension in the auction hall had reached its peak. The murmur of the crowd, once casual and indifferent, now grew heavy, thick with anticipation. Richard Grant, who had been a towering figure throughout the auction, stood face to face with Jonathan. His arrogance, once clear in every word and step, was now beginning to crack under the intensity of Jonathan's unwavering gaze. The wealthy auctioneer, used to controlling every situation, now found himself momentarily disoriented by the sheer determination in the eyes of the older man standing before him. "You don't belong here, old man," Richard spat, his voice now sharp with irritation. He had tried to dismiss Jonathan, to belittle him in front of the crowd, but nothing worked. Jonathan's resolve remained unshaken. Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His grip on the straw hat tightened, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Every laugh, every dismissive glance from the crowd, only made his resolve stronger. The weight of the years he had carried, the pain of loss, and the fire that had taken everything from him seemed to fuel him, giving him strength. He wasn't going to back down this time. Not for anything. With a voice that was calm but firm, Jonathan spoke, "That horse is mine, and I will not let anyone take him from me again." The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the raw determination that Jonathan's words conveyed. Richard Grant was momentarily taken aback, his usually composed demeanor faltering. The murmurs from the crowd had stopped. All eyes were now on Jonathan, who stood tall despite the odds stacked against him. Richard's face tightened, but the power he once held over the room was slipping away. He had expected a show, a retreat, but what he got was something far more potent. Jonathan wasn't just standing there to win a horse. He was standing to reclaim a part of himself, a part of his soul that had been ripped away by fire and time. The crowd, for the first time, began to see Jonathan not as a foolish old man, but as a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Richard tried again, his voice laced with anger, but it was clear his control over the situation was waning. "You're making a fool of yourself," he sneered, trying to reassert his dominance, but the doubt in his eyes was evident. The crowd's perception had shifted, and Richard could feel the change. Jonathan didn't answer, but his stance spoke volumes. Every inch of him radiated a quiet strength that resonated deep within the hearts of those watching. He wasn't the same man who had been dismissed so easily earlier. This was a man who had faced fire, had lost it all, and yet still stood, still fought for what mattered. The words Richard had used to belittle him earlier no longer held weight. Jonathan's presence was undeniable. His message was simple, clear, and resolute. Thunderstorm was his, and he would not let anyone take him away again. Then, something miraculous happened. As if on cue, Thunderstorm, who had stood quietly in the pen, suddenly shifted. The crowd, watching the two men locked in their silent battle, turned their attention to the horse. It was subtle at first, a slight movement, a twitch of the ears, but it was enough to stir a sense of awe in the crowd. Jonathan felt it before he saw it. He felt the shift, the energy in the air. His heart beat faster as his eyes locked onto Thunderstorm once more. There was a change in the horse's posture, a slight tilt of its head, as if it were suddenly aware of the man standing before it. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. The world around them seemed to fall away. The crowd, once so loud and judgmental, was now silent, waiting for something they couldn't quite understand but knew was happening in that moment. Thunderstorm, the powerful animal that had been so still and calm, began to move. It was slow at first, just a step, then another, but as it moved closer to Jonathan, the bond between them grew palpable. Thunderstorm's eyes never left Jonathan. There was no hesitation, no confusion in the horse's movements. It knew him. It remembered him. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Thunderstorm walked toward Jonathan, each step deliberate and purposeful. The sound of hooves on the ground seemed louder than usual, each beat a testament to the connection that was unfolding in front of them. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch out for eternity, Thunderstorm lowered its head, gently nuzzling Jonathan's shoulder. The crowd gasped in unison. It was as though the world had stopped turning. Time itself held its breath. Jonathan reached up, his hands trembling as they touched the soft coat of the horse, his heart swelling with emotion. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The reunion between him and Thunderstorm spoke louder than any words ever could. It wasn't just a horse. It wasn't just a man. It was the rekindling of a bond that had survived the fire, the years of separation, and the agony of loss. Thunderstorm, the horse Jonathan had once trained, once loved, had come back to him, not as an animal, but as a part of his soul, a piece of the past that had never truly left him. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Many had never seen anything like this. Some people had heard rumors of the fire, of the loss, but seeing it unfold in front of them was something different. They had been watching a man struggle for a horse, yes, but what they had witnessed was far more profound. They had seen a soul find its way back to the one it had been torn from. For Jonathan, it wasn't about winning an auction. It wasn't about a horse at all. It was about reclaiming a piece of himself that had been lost for far too long. It was about remembering the love, the companionship, the simple joys of a life once shared with his beloved Thunderstorm. As Thunderstorm's warm breath brushed against Jonathan's face, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "You came back, didn't you?" His voice cracked, filled with emotion, but there was peace in it too. Peace that had eluded him for so long. The crowd, still silent, began to stir. There was no more laughter, no more mockery. The man they had once dismissed as foolish had just reminded them of something important, the unbreakable bond between a person and what they hold dear. Thunderstorm had recognized Jonathan, and in that moment, so had the crowd. This wasn't about a transaction. This was about something far greater. It was about love, loss, and the undeniable power of a bond that can never be broken. And for Jonathan, it was about reclaiming a part of himself that had never truly been lost. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, as though the very ground beneath Jonathan's feet was charged with electricity. The crowd, once divided in their judgment, now found themselves silenced in awe. Their eyes were fixed on Jonathan and Thunderstorm, as if the power of their bond had somehow transcended the moment, leaving them all mere spectators of something far greater than any of them could have anticipated. But for Jonathan, this was no longer just about Thunderstorm. This was about something he had lost long ago, the sense of himself, his dignity, and his place in the world. With Thunderstorm by his side, everything that had been taken from him felt like it might slowly begin to return. But the road ahead was not going to be easy. And standing before him, like a shadow that still clung to his every step, was Richard Grant, the man who had taken everything from him. Richard was seething now, his face twisted with both disbelief and fury. His once confident demeanor had cracked under the weight of the situation. For a man who thought he could control everything, this moment had revealed just how little he truly understood about the strength of the human spirit. Jonathan, still holding Thunderstorm's muzzle gently, turned his gaze towards Richard. His heart was no longer burdened by the grief that had once consumed him. In its place was a quiet strength, something that had grown from years of suffering and silence, a strength that now pulsed through every fiber of his being. He had fought for this, and he would not let it slip away again. Richard stepped forward, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "This is a business, Jonathan. You have no place here." "The horse is mine," he spat, his voice cold and cutting. He could see the shift in the crowd, the way their eyes were no longer with him, and it infuriated him. He had been in control, and now it felt as though everything was slipping through his fingers. But Jonathan stood firm. There was no more fear, no more self-doubt. His mind was clear, his purpose singular. "This horse is not yours," he said, his voice unwavering, yet laced with the years of suffering and longing that had led him to this moment. "It belongs to me. And I will not let you take him from me again." Richard's lips curled into a tight, arrogant smile. He was used to winning. He was used to having people like Jonathan bend to his will. But Jonathan was different. His words, his calmness, it rattled Richard in ways he couldn't explain. He raised his hand, ready to give the order to end the auction. But before he could speak, the crowd's murmur grew louder, a wave of whispers running through the onlookers. "Enough, Richard." It was the voice of Deputy Frank Mallory, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, silently observing the confrontation. Now, he stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt, his posture calm but resolute. Frank had known Jonathan for years. He knew the man was no fool. He had seen the pain and loss in Jonathan's eyes, and for the first time, he understood what the horse represented, not just to Jonathan, but to everyone who had watched him suffer in silence all these years. Richard faltered, glaring at Frank. "You're not going to side with this old man, are you?" he sneered. "I'm not siding with anyone, Richard," Frank replied, his voice steady. "But I will side with what's right." Richard was taken aback. The deputy, whom he had always considered a tool, had just publicly questioned his authority, and it was not something Richard had anticipated. His hand shook slightly, but he tried to cover it with another scornful smile. "This is a legal matter. The horse is mine by every right. There's no room for sentimental nonsense." But the crowd had begun to stir. The atmosphere in the auction house had shifted completely. No longer was it a place of commerce. It had become a battleground between justice and greed. Jonathan didn't speak, but his eyes were fixed on Richard with unwavering intensity. And in that moment, everything changed. Thunderstorm, still calm and composed, shifted. Its ears flicked forward, its eyes locked onto Richard, and for the briefest moment, the horse seemed to grow taller, as though it, too, was preparing for the final confrontation. Richard saw the change in the horse. The defiance in its stance. The connection between Jonathan and Thunderstorm was undeniable, and Richard could see it now more clearly than ever. The horse wasn't just a piece of property, it was a living being with a mind of its own, with a bond to Jonathan that transcended mere ownership. Thunderstorm took a few slow steps toward Richard, its head held high, and for the first time in a long time, Richard Grant felt something he hadn't in years: fear. Not of Jonathan, but of the power this simple man, and this horse, held over him. His empire of wealth, his control over others, had always given him a sense of invincibility. But now, faced with the raw power of this bond, he realized that the things money could never buy, loyalty, love, and justice, were the things that truly held power. Frank, still standing at the edge, stepped closer. His voice was calm, but firm as he addressed Richard. "You want this to be a legal matter? Fine. But you'd better have proof," he said. "Because I've seen enough." Jonathan remained silent, but in his heart, a storm was brewing. The years of pain, the years of regret, and the years of silence were now coming to an end. He didn't need to fight Richard with words. He didn't need to argue. All he needed was to stand there, with Thunderstorm by his side, and let the truth speak for itself. And then, as if on cue, Thunderstorm took one final step forward, lowering its head gently and touching Richard's shoulder. The touch was light, almost tender, but it was a gesture of undeniable strength. Thunderstorm wasn't just acknowledging Jonathan, it was telling Richard that this bond could not be broken, and it would not be sold. Richard stood still, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. In that moment, he knew he had lost. He could feel the weight of his own arrogance crumbling around him. He had always believed that money and power could buy anything, but now he saw something far greater. Jonathan had fought not just for a horse, but for something that could not be bought or sold, something deeper than any material possession. Jonathan looked at Richard one last time, his voice low but powerful. "I've lost everything before," he said, "but I won't lose him. Not this time." Richard didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could. The battle was over, and Jonathan had won, not with fists, but with the strength of his heart. With Richard retreating, the auction hall was still. Jonathan, with Thunderstorm by his side, stood there as if nothing else mattered. The weight of the years, of the fire, of the loss, seemed to fall away in the presence of his horse. The crowd, now hushed, began to understand. As Jonathan slowly led Thunderstorm out of the pen, the crowd parted to let them through. No one spoke, but the respect in their eyes was evident. In that moment, Jonathan wasn't just a man who had fought for a horse. He was a man who had reclaimed his soul. And as he walked out of the auction house, with Thunderstorm's warm breath against his side, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He had lost so much, but today, he had found what truly mattered. The days that followed the auction were some of the most peaceful Jonathan had known in years. He had walked out of the auction house with Thunderstorm by his side, not as a symbol of victory over Richard Grant, but as a sign of something far more important, a personal victory over the grief, the loss, and the bitterness that had held him captive for so long. As he left the place that had seen him suffer for years, Jonathan felt like a man who had stepped out of the shadows of his past and into a new light. The land around Clayville, though still familiar, seemed different now, as though it too had recognized the change in him. The sun seemed to shine a little brighter on the fields, the air a little crisper. Jonathan spent his days with Thunderstorm, tending to the land, slowly rebuilding what had been lost. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments when the weight of the past would creep in. The memories of the fire, of the night he had lost everything, still haunted him at times. But now, there was something different inside him, a quiet peace, a sense of purpose that he hadn't known before. Thunderstorm, as always, was there by his side. The horse had become more than just a companion. It was his anchor, his reminder that despite the tragedies of life, there was still beauty, still love, still something worth fighting for. They worked together on the farm, Jonathan tending to the crops, the horses, and everything in between, while Thunderstorm stood as his constant companion. There was a new rhythm to Jonathan's life now. Each day felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. He had found a way to move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by accepting it, embracing it, and learning from it. He had learned that no matter how much he had lost, there were always second chances, always new beginnings. Jonathan began to rebuild not just his farm, but his spirit. He started to trust again, not just in the land, but in himself. The man who had once been lost in the shadows of his past had begun to find his way into the light. He had learned that strength didn't come from never falling, but from getting back up each time. The months passed, and as the seasons shifted, so did Jonathan. He no longer felt the weight of the past in the same way. The memories of the fire were still there, but they no longer controlled him. Instead, he had taken the pain and turned it into something stronger, something that fueled his drive to keep going. He had found peace, not in forgetting, but in understanding. One evening, as Jonathan sat on the porch of his modest home, watching the sunset with Thunderstorm by his side, he reflected on all that had transpired. He thought about the years of struggle, the moments of doubt, the agony of loss, and the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. The auction, the confrontation with Richard Grant, the reunion with Thunderstorm, it had all led him here, to a place of healing. Jonathan realized that the true victory had not been winning Thunderstorm back, it had been finding his way back to himself. The horse was a symbol, a reminder of everything he had fought for, but the real battle had been the one within him. The battle to reclaim his life, his peace, and his sense of self. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, Thunderstorm nudged him gently, its warm breath brushing against his arm. Jonathan smiled, his heart full. The connection between him and the horse went beyond words. It was a bond that time could not break, no fire could consume, no loss could erase. It was a bond that had withstood the test of time and tragedy. Jonathan stroked Thunderstorm's mane gently, his fingers running through the thick coat, and he whispered, "We made it, didn't we, boy?" In that moment, the wind picked up, carrying with it the fresh scent of earth and grass, the promise of new beginnings. Jonathan realized that life would never be the same. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He had found something stronger than the memories of loss. He had found resilience, he had found hope, and above all, he had found love. So, the story of Jonathan and Thunderstorm has come to a close, but the lessons of everlasting friendship, perseverance, and the unwavering fight to never give up will remain in our hearts forever. Jonathan didn't just fight for a horse, he fought for himself, for the memories and values he had lost. This story serves as a reminder that, no matter how much life takes from us, there is always an opportunity to reclaim what truly matters. Did this story move you? Are you ready to fight for what you hold dear, even when everything around you seems to be dragging you down? If this story has touched your heart, share it with the ones you love. A small action from you can change someone's life forever. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share what this story has made you reflect upon. And if you feel this story deserves to be heard, don't forget to like and share it to spread the message of friendship, resilience, and love. If you want to continue experiencing these meaningful stories and profound messages, subscribe to the channel now so you won't miss any story that could touch your heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back soon with more stories, where we explore the power of love, resilience, and the invaluable lessons of life.